a play more than anything else was what drew me then to writing, and what keeps me there, that I'm able to find a way to amuse myself for years at a time, doing the equivalent of blah, 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 scribbling. I look like a baby. I must have been about 25 years
Hello and salut. Welcome to Honto Ego, Japan's only 99.9% English podcast hosted at my dinner table. My name is Matt. I'm a Canadian living in Japan. And if you're wondering why I said hello and salut today, salut is one of the greetings in French. And being from Canada, today I wanted to talk about a great Canadian author. As you may know, English and French are the two languages officially of Canada. Now today I'm going to talk about the Canadian author Andre Alexis. Andre Alexis. Have you heard of Andre Alexis? To be honest, I might be surprised if you have. He's not too famous outside of Canada, I want to say. Although he gained some fame a bit recently. In 2015, his book 15 Dogs was really well received and it won many prizes and awards. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that book and about a few other books that Andre Alexis has written in the past decade. But first, a quick biography of Andre Alexis. So he was born in 1957 in Trinidad, but he grew up in Ottawa, right, the capital of Canada. And that's where he started his writing career. He was working for the Canadian Stage Company, which is a stage theater, troupe or group, right, in Canada, and he was writing plays for them. That's why in the interview that I included at the beginning of this episode, he's talking about why he loves plays and how plays kind of bring him back to his love for writing all the time. So by the late 90s, a few of his plays were published as books, and he published a couple novels, some short stories, a children's book. But the real thing that I think launched him into fame and renown in Canada is what he calls the quincunx cycle. Okay, now, if you've never heard of what a quincunx is, I don't blame you. A quincunx, quin is a prefix on a word meaning 5, right? So the shape of a quincunx is like the 5 side of a die or dice, right? So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 corners and one more dot or whatever in the middle. So he has this series of 5 novels, which he calls the quincunx cycle. Now, all of these novels are set in Canada. Particularly, they are set in southern Ontario. Okay, so near Ottawa, near Toronto, or in Toronto, and around there, right? That area of Canada. And the novels are all different. They all have different plots and different, characters for the most part. But there are a few strands of connection between them. So some characters may appear in more than one novel, but generally you can read each novel separately and enjoy them on their own. So before I recommend any specific book, let me just give you a quick elevator pitch on Andre Alexis and why I think you would enjoy him, okay? So number one, this is a big one, I think, for many readers, right? Especially people who English is not their first language. His books are relatively short, right? Every book in the quincunx cycle is around 200 pages. So, as an English teacher, it's really hard for me to recommend, Dostoevsky or somebody like that and throw you a 1,000-page novel and go, here, read this, right? But a 200-page novel, a 160-page novel, I think that's very, manageable, right? So you can enjoy his books, and it shouldn't take too long to read them, even if English is not your first language. So his books are short. That's not a great recommendation. But within those books, they are so beautiful, okay? Now, his writing style is relatively simple. His sentences are not too long or too difficult, but they include within them a lot of thought and a lot of care, and they just feel beautifully written. It's not punchy and short like Ernest Hemingway. It's short and concise or compact like reading poetry. Within a few words that are well chosen, he can say so much, right? And so his books are pretty philosophical. Not all of them, but generally, right, he tackles a lot of philosophy, and he talks about, what it means to be human in a lot of his books. One last thing that I'll recommend about all of his books is that in the Quincunx cycle, and I think all of his writing, he writes about Canada, And as a Canadian, I grew up in southern Ontario. I lived in Ottawa, and I lived in Toronto for many years. So the places that he writes about are real, and I've been there and I've lived there. And so to me, it feels very, I don't know, it's cool to see somebody writing about those places. A lot of people are interested in Canada, but I don't think there's that much literature that represents Canada, or at least not that much literature about Canada that people not living in Canada read. You know what I mean? Let me rephrase that. Only Canadians read about Canada, right? Maybe, people like Anne of Green Gables. That's great. That's beautiful. But we need something a little more modern, okay? And that's why it's great to have 5 beautiful novels from the past 10 years about Canada today. I love that. Now, the genre, the type of novels that Andre Alexis writes, it would be classified at a library or a bookstore as literary fiction, which, that's such a vague, unclear term. That means it doesn't really have a genre, but I would call it magical realism. In all of his novels, it feels like the real world with a dash of magic thrown into the mix, okay? So dogs gain the ability to talk. There's a magic ring. There are werewolves or vampires or whatever. These kind of fantasy elements or magical elements come into the real world, and people react to them in a realistic, modern way. So if you like that kind of thing, if you like magical realism, I think you will really love his books. It's not fantasy like Lord of the Rings or Dungeons and Dragons. It's fantasy more like, Gabriel Garcia Marquez or Haruki Murakami. Okay, so let's get down to the book recommendations, the nitty-gritty, right? The beautiful, beautiful recommendations. So the first book that I'll recommend by Andre Alexis, it's very easy to recommend because it's the one that he's won the most awards for, is 15 Dogs. The name of the book is 15 Dogs, 15 Dogs. 15 Dogs is a really, cute novel on the surface, right? Because it's about dogs, and who doesn't love dogs? So the basic plot of 15 Dogs is one day in Toronto, the Greek gods Hermes and Apollo are looking down at humans and at animals, and they're thinking like, wow, look how unhappy humans are. I wonder why, right? And they wonder like, are humans destined to be unhappy? So right off the bat, it's pretty philosophical. Then they see a group of 15 dogs being held at the pound, right? The kind of jail for dogs, right? Wild dogs. And they make a bet that if they give these 15 dogs human-level intelligence and consciousness and the ability to communicate with each other, they bet that the dogs will die unhappy. Okay? A bit dark sounding, but it's real. And so I believe it's Apollo. Apollo bets that the dogs are going to die unhappily, whereas Hermes is betting that the dogs will find happiness and die, with a smile on their face, basically. So the novel follows these 15 dogs who suddenly gain human consciousness or human level intelligence, and they begin naming themselves and communicating with each other. And it's kind of like Lord of the Flies, like that novel, where they break off into tribes and they run around High Park, the kind of central park in Toronto, and they form tribes and gangs, and sometimes they fight each other, sometimes they run and live with humans and hide, and sometimes they start writing poetry, and sometimes, they all go into their own separate ways of life, right? Crossing over with each other quite often. So, fair warning, it is a pretty dark book, as often as it is cute and funny because, of seeing dogs acting like dogs mixed with humans. It can also be quite dark because some of the dogs will attack each other. There's some sexual violence between the dogs, right? They are animals after all. But it's a very real look at like the nature of dogs and the nature of humans. So really cute, interesting fantasy style premise, idea of the book, but it's executed in a very mature, thoughtful way. And to be honest, I think by the end of the book, you might be very emotional, right? You might be very emotionally attached to the dogs. The second book of his that I'll recommend, also from the Quinn-Kunk cycle, is one that I'm actually listening to right now. So the cool thing about Andre Alexis is that he records all of his own audiobooks. I love hearing the author read their own work, right? And Andre Alexis, as you heard in today's intro to the episode, he has a great voice. It's very relaxing, it's very deep, and hearing him voice the different characters, including the dogs in 15 Dogs, it's really charming. So the second book that I'm listening to right now, it's called Days by Moonlight. So the story of Days by Moonlight, it follows a young man named Alfred, and he is a botanist, right? And a botanist is a guy or a person who researches plants. He's like a plant scientist. So Alfred, he recently lost his parents in a car crash. So much of the novel is him kind of, processing through that grief. And he's on a road trip driving one of his parents' old friends, Professor Bruno. And Professor Bruno is a literary professor. He's a professor of literature. And he gets Alfred to drive him through southern Ontario from small town to small town, retracing the steps of a poet he admires. So a lot of the book is, reflections on poetry, reflections on family and death, like, losing family members, reflections on friendship, between Alfred and Professor Bruno. And most interestingly, the towns that they visit in southern Ontario, they explore a lot of themes of racism and poverty and, the working class or the lower class in Canada. These are things that are not really reflected in novels anywhere, not even in Canada. And what's funny is I grew up in a small town. They name drop, they mention towns very close to the town that I grew up in. So for me, it was quite impactful to hear about. But each town that they visit in southern Ontario, they are unraveling the mystery or the legend of this poet that they're, studying. But along the way, they meet really strange people, and they all have these kind of unique things. The further along they go, town to town, the more strange the townspeople are. And they find these strange ceremonies and rituals that the townspeople are doing. And it gets to the point of like fantasy or magical realism, where sometimes they do really odd, ridiculous things. I don't want to spoil, the weird things that happen in the novel, but it kind of reminded me of the novel and movie Big Fish. If you know that story Big Fish, where it's on surface level, it's like normal life, southern Ontario of Canada, but beneath that normal surface, there's a lot of oddities happening, a lot of strange things going on. Anyway, I recommend it. I'm not finished listening to it yet, but I'll let you know how I like it. The last novel that I want to recommend, this was actually the last novel that completed Andre Alexis's quincunx cycle, and the name of that novel is Ring. Not the Japanese novel Ring about the scary girl that comes out of the TV, although that is also a great novel. This Ring by Andre Alexis, it came out in 2021, and it's set in Toronto, like 15 Dogs. So the main character of Ring is a young girl named Gwen. And Gwen meets a young man in Toronto named Tancred. And this is probably the biggest connection between the quincunx cycle novels, because Tancred is actually the main character of another novel, The Hidden Keys, which I didn't recommend today. But anyway, this story is about Gwen. And this is the most romantic of all of Andre Alexis's stories. So it's a romance between Gwen and Tancred. They have a young love, it's growing, they're learning more about each other, they're drawing closer together, and Gwen goes to meet her mother and father, right? And she wants Tancred to meet them as well. And it starts, much of the novel starts off as just a straightforward romance, right? And it is very interesting and very convincing. But then, very gradually, like in many of Andre Alexis's novels, the magical elements begin to appear. And I won't spoil too much of the magic in Ring, but the title refers to a magic ring that is passed down in Gwen's family that allows the woman who wears the ring or gives it to her lover to have 3 wishes or 3 things about her lover that she wants to change before they get married. Okay? So it's kind of this meditation, this philosophical look on love and romance and on whether it's right to change people, right? She has this magical power to change Tancred to be however she wants him to be, and she's unsure if it's the right thing to do. Okay, well, that's it for my recommendation of Andre Alexis. Just to, go through the name of all of the quincunx cycle novels, I will just read them out to you now, okay? The first one in 2014 was Pastoral, the novel called Pastoral. Then in 2015, 15 Dogs. The third novel, but it was the last one published in 2021, is Ring. The fourth novel is The Hidden Keys, published in 2016. And the fifth novel is Days by Moonlight, published in 2019. So today I recommended 15 Dogs, Ring, and Days by Moonlight. But, of course, I recommend all 5 of them. They are all great novels, and you don't have to read all 5, you can just read one. So if the idea of 15 Dogs is interesting to you, or if you like romance, and you want to read Ring, whatever, right? Go for it. I think they're all great. Thank you for listening to Honto Ego. As always, please follow me on Instagram at Honto Ego Pod, HontoEigopod, on Instagram. And if you have any questions about grammar or book recommendations or ideas for topics that I can talk about on the show, please email me at hontoego@gmail.com. Anyway, thanks again, and ta-ta for now. Bye.
I look like a baby.